North Idaho College, in cooperation with KSPS TV, presents Earth in Crisis, a search for solutions. Highlights from the 38th Annual NIC Popcorn Forum. The 2008 symposium featured guest lectures and public discussion on 5 critical issues facing the world today. This is Episode 5, The Horrors of Ethnic and Tribal Genocide in the 21st Century.
Welcome to the 5th and final one-hour documentary based on the subject Earth in Crisis, A Search for Solutions. On today's documentary, our subtopic is The Horrors of Ethnic and Tribal Genocide in the 21st Century. This documentary will feature a very prominent expert on this subject, Dr. James Waller, Jr., who has a PhD in psychology and is a professor of psychology at Whitworth University in Spokane, Washington. He is acclaimed for his remarkable book on this subject titled Becoming Evil: How Ordinary People Commit Genocide and Mass Killing. He will be joined on the documentary with some panelists who are also experts in the field, as well as some visuals that we have. Thank you for being with us on this documentary.
What I want to spend time talking with you about today is crisis that comes from within, from the standpoint of crisis that involves humans perpetrating deliberately extraordinary evil on other humans in the context of war, terrorism, both anti-state terrorism and state-sponsored terrorism as well. And we'll do that through the focus on perpetrators of genocide, mass killing. And a large part of what I'll spend my time on is what I've spent most of my research on over the past 15 years, which is how perpetrators are made. Who are these people? Where do they come from? How is it that they're transformed, I will argue, from quote-unquote ordinary people into people capable of committing the extraordinary evil that we see in genocide, mass killing? Many of you know the story from the Hebrew Scriptures of Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve's sons. Hebrew Scriptures tell us that one day Cain and Abel make a sacrifice to Yahweh, and for whatever reason, unclear, but probably having to do with intention and motivation, God looks with favor upon Abel's sacrifice and with disfavor upon Cain's sacrifice. And then Scriptures go on to say that at some point in the future, Cain falls upon his brother Abel in the field and kills him. There aren't a lot of people in the world at this time. 2 men, says Vizel, and one of them becomes a killer. This is the first time death makes its appearance in the world in a tradition that has influenced millions of people around the world and their understanding of their place in history. The first time death occurs in the world, and it occurs in the form of murder. Since the Napoleonic Wars, we fought an average of 6 international wars and 6 civil wars per decade, an average of 3 high-fatality struggles ongoing at any moment in the world since 1900. High fatality means a loss of life of more than 1,000 victims in cases of war or state-sponsored terrorism. So pick any year since 1900, any month of that year, any day of that month, any hour of that day, any minute of that hour, any second of that minute, and since 1900, an average of 3 high-fatality struggles going on at any point over that past century. The 4 decades after the end of World War II see 150 wars and only 26 days of world peace. And today, actually, more than 1/3 of the world's nations, including ours, are involved in some type of war and conflict. This is more than twice the level of the world's nations in absolute terms that would have been involved in conflict at the height of the Cold War. There are 2 quotes I often think about when I see this slide and this part in the presentation. First quote comes from Winston Churchill, who has said, "The story of the human race is war." And I think about that quote a lot, because if you were given the task by a professor to tell the story of humankind, but you could only tell it through one lens or one perspective, what would be the best way to tell that story? Through the disease, through geopolitical issues, through evolution, through sexual behavior? But what lens could you tell the story through that would give us the best idea today of how we've come to be who we are, how our nation states have carved themselves up, the distribution of languages, the distribution of culture, the distribution of disease? I mean, all the things that make up the human story today, if you had to tell that story through one lens, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a better one than war. I mean, that's how much war has been a crisis throughout human history as a shaping and motivating force. The other quote I often think of here is Plato's famous quote, where he says, "Only the dead have seen the end of war. The number of absolute conflicts have increased by about 5 times compared to the 19th century, and by about 10 times compared to the 18th century as well." So the short story of this is that war and conflict has not only been a pretty constant piece of human history and the human story, but in many ways it's a piece of who we are that continues to accelerate. Some of you may have heard in the mid-1990s, late 1990s, some well-publicized findings that war was finally beginning to drop off, that peace was increasing around the world, the number of absolute conflicts had stalled and even declined to some degree, and that would have been true by 1998, 1998, 1999. But today in 2008, the most recent data indicate that the number of conflicts have again accelerated. They've again increased. So in terms of crises that are affecting humankind and certainly affecting the world, again, I'm hard-pressed to think of one that is more disruptive to the human experience today than these cases of war. There's a line between what is acceptable in warfare and what becomes criminal conduct. I am interested, my research focuses on what happens when that line is crossed between acceptable military conduct and unacceptable criminal conduct. This line, when it's crossed, comes into the territory of what we'd call genocide, or occasionally mass killing. And many times a political, religious, or social group comes to power and it will say there's a group of people living among us that we no longer wish to live among us. And they'll force them to immigrate from the country. They will sometimes isolate them in ghettos and large cities within their own countries. But what happens in genocide is a ruling regime takes that statement I just said and takes off the final phrase. And it becomes a political, social, religious group no longer wishes a group of people to live among them. And we take off that final piece, and it simply becomes they no longer wish a group of people to live, period. So the focus is not on immigration. The focus is not on expulsion. The focus is not on ghettoization. The focus becomes, for a genocidal regime, simply outright extermination. And when a regime has made that decision, they have made a decision that's going to compel them into an episode of genocidal violence. Genocide is as old as human history. But the 20th century, the world got, in the morally inverted sense of the word, good at genocide. We perfected techniques of mass destruction. The Holocaust is certainly the most notable example of this, but the 20th century is so replete with cases of genocide that scholars in the field often refer to it as the age of genocide. Beginning in 1904, with the destruction of a native Southwest African population of people, the Herero, by German colonizers, about 80,000 Herero in Southwest Africa at that point in history. They dared to fight back against Germans who were colonizing their country, and in retribution, German military forces exterminated almost every single Herero in Southwest Africa. 1915 to 1923, the murder of over 1 million, actually 1.5 million Armenians by an Islamic Turkish regime, in what is recognized as kind of the first total state-sponsored genocide of the 20th century. An important one because every April of every year, Armenians around the world remember this genocide today, and they commemorate it, which they must do because Turkey, as a matter of official government policy, still denies that this genocide ever occurred. And many of you will be aware of the very delicate relationship between Turkey and the U.S., and our need for foreign policy and warfare to have an ally in Turkey, but also many people's request here in the U.S. government that Turkey admit genocide. And if Turkey were ever to do that, or be forced to do it, certainly that would threaten the very uneasy diplomatic relations we currently hold. Implementation of Soviet man-made famine in the Ukraine in 32 to 33. Estimates run as high as 15 million Ukrainian peasants who lost their lives not because of natural famine, but because of a Stalin-implemented man-made famine. It was only 2 years ago, in 2006, that the Ukrainian government finally felt the freedom to pass legislation and a resolution declaring this event what most scholars recognize it as, which was genocide. The Holocaust of 1939 to 1945, the loss of life of 6 million Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe. That's 2 out of every 3 of Europe's Jews. And then here, mass killings and genocide in Indonesia, Bangladesh, Burundi, Cambodia, East Timor, Guatemala, Iraq, Rwanda, and Bosnia-Herzegovina in the former Yugoslavia. Here you see some pictures that I actually took last July 2007 as part of a group called the International Commission for Missing Persons. We excavated one of the mass graves from the 1995 genocide at Srebrenica. This is one of about 300 graves where the bodies of 8,000 Muslim men and boys were disposed of after the slaughter in Srebrenica by Bosnian Serbs of Bosnian Muslims in July 1995. This is a grave that was not discovered until June of 2007, and part of my work with ICMP was to literally dig out this mass grave, which held the remains of about 50 people. It's a secondary grave, which means that these were people who were killed elsewhere and buried elsewhere in a mass grave, and then they were dug up and placed somewhere that the Serbs thought would be safer. So there are body parts in here of roughly 50 different people that hopefully next year by this time will be identified, their families notified, but you have thousands of Muslim families still today in the former Yugoslavia just awaiting word on where the remains are of the victims of the slaughter in Srebrenica in 1995. All told, if we were to take all these episodes here that I've listed on the screen and try to quantify or weigh the amount of evil and destruction genocide causes, the number of victims from these genocides listed on the screen would total more than 60 million victims in the 20th century. And again, this has to be contrasted, I think, as we think about foreign policy in the world and crises in it, with the reality of the destruction that anti-state terrorism causes. Anti-state terrorism is when a group not in power tries to inflict terror on a civilian population. They try to influence politics by other means. The most notable example, obviously, the infamous example, recently would be 9/11. Anti-state terrorism is a significant human problem and a crisis in its own right. But in the 20th century, anti-state terrorism took the number of lives of only about 500,000. Now, I hate to even say only 500,000 because every one of those is someone who loved someone else, was loved by someone else. They had hopes, dreams, and aspirations that would never be fulfilled. So I don't want to minimize any one of those 500,000 victims. But when you think again about crises afflicting the world, and you weigh 500,000 victims of anti-state terrorism, which is all we seem to think about in foreign policy, versus 60 million victims of state-sponsored terrorism in the same time period, and you're asked anyone in the field, what's the more significant problem? Clearly, it's state-sponsored terrorism in the form of genocide, but it's the problem that the world tends to pay, by and large, the least attention to. The most significant genocide emergency right now, which means that genocide is ongoing, is in the Darfur region of Sudan, which is the western region of Sudan, that has a casualty rate now going on its 4th year of a genocide recognized by scholars, a genocide recognized by the Bush administration, going on its 4th year of genocidal activity in which about 10 to 15,000 people a month are losing their lives, either because of direct violence or because of the indirect results of the violence and conflict in Darfur, the starvation, the poisoning of wells by dismembered body parts in some villages as the Janjaweed come through. So again, the one thing I'd hate for you to leave here today is to think that this crisis of genocide and state-sponsored terrorism is simply a crisis of history, and we should have done something at that time, but it's not relevant today. This is exceptionally relevant today. Ethiopia and Kenya are countries that are coming close to being included on this genocide watch list. So there's no one who works in the field of genocide studies as I do that would say this is a time for complacency because the world's a calmer place, it's a more peaceful place, and we just simply don't have to worry about episodes of genocide. If anything, we feel almost the exact opposite on every one of those statements. Political, social, or religious groups wanting to commit mass murder do. There are a lot of obstacles they have to overcome, but the one thing they don't have to worry about is recruiting the people to carry out the killing. humans are the weapons of genocide. I mean, sometimes people get caught up in the technology, particularly of Nazi Germany. Students in my Holocaust course can almost be mesmerized by the technological, bureaucratic sophistication that was involved in the Holocaust. But that's not what causes genocide. It's humans killing other humans in large numbers over an extended period of time. In Nazi Germany, there is, for part of the killing, a significant distance between perpetrator and victim that makes it seem mechanical. But Rwanda, Armenia, would have been face-to-face killing. It's what people at the time wrote of as the hard work of killing. In Rwanda, it's killing by machete. It's killing by masu, clubs studded through with nails. It's killing by simply kicking and beating people to death. So this is not a technological issue. It's a human issue. It's not a technological crisis. It's a human crisis of humans choosing to engage in mass murder in large numbers and over an extended period of time. Now again, what strikes me about this principle is that it just is so inconsistent with the world that you and I want to live and work in. I mean, I want to be in a world where a genocidal regime comes to power and it wants to murder, and all the obstacles it has to worry about, resistance from the victim group, that's real. Resistance from other people in the community who say you can't do this, that's real. Resistance from the international community, that's not as real, to be honest with you, but it should be more real, right? But of all the things they have to worry about, they don't have to worry about finding the killers. I want to be in a world where they have to worry about that, where a genocidal regime comes to power and says, we'd love to kill this group of people living in our midst, but we can't find the perpetrators to carry it out. The truth is, no genocidal regime has ever had to worry about finding killers. And it's not just because they can rely on the military, and the military has to do what they're told. Because many of the genocides in the 20th century, Rwanda and Armenia, chief among them, had very high civilian involvement and very low military involvement. So the issue is, when people are given permission to kill, they find reasons to do that. And to do that at times easily, to do it with creativity, to even do it with gusto and enthusiasm and zest over a period of time. So this is the principle that I start from, is genocidal regimes can find the killers, and then it leads me to these two questions. Well, how many people, who are we talking about here among these killers? How many people does it take to carry out genocide and mass killing? Now understand, that's an unanswerable question, because the only people we really prosecute and bring to justice are the architects of genocide. And I'm not asking here about architects like Hitler and Himmler and Goering in Nazi Germany. I'm not asking a question here about the mid-level bureaucrats like an Adolf Eichmann who keeps the train runnings on time to Auschwitz. Architects and mid-level bureaucrats, by and large, never kill anyone face to face. Doesn't make them any less responsible. They're fully morally and legally accountable for the policies and initiatives they put in place. But I'm interested in this third group, the rank and file perpetrators who actually carry out the killing. Because without them, genocide doesn't happen, right? If all you have are architects, all you have are mid-level bureaucrats, but you can't find anyone to do the hard work of killing, genocide's not going to happen. So the issue I'm asking here, the question I'm asking, is who are the rank and file? And oddly enough, they're the group we know the least about. They're not the ones we tend to bring to justice. We bring the architects to justice. We bring some mid-level bureaucrats to justice. The rank and file pretty well escape and go back to doing whatever they were doing before the war started. So numbers here, precise numbers, are impossible. The estimates in the Holocaust run as high as 500,000 Germans, Croats, Ukrainians, Slavs, who would have participated face-to-face in the destruction of 6 million of Europe's Jews. Rwanda, 1994, 800,000 people in Rwanda die in a 100-day period beginning in April 1994. Now, you can take any segment of the Holocaust, which ran from 39 to 45. Take any 100-day segment, and you'll never find a rate of death like that. Rwanda was incredible in the death and destruction with absolutely no technology. just machete, just masu, just hands, just feet, 800,000 people in a 100-day period. How many perpetrators involved in something like that? One of my first contacts in Rwanda told me in a year or two after the genocide that he estimated more than 1 million perpetrators. And how could you have more perpetrators than you have victims? I asked him. And he said, well, because much of the killing was done by gangs of young people, particularly in the capital city of Kigali, ganging up and kicking, beating, clubbing, hacking victims to death. So he argued we probably have more perpetrators than we have victims. Now, I think the more recent estimates of perpetrators in Rwanda are more like 250,000 people. But again, you've got 250,000 people that for 100 days literally exhausted themselves with the hard work of killing in Rwanda. Srebrenica, where I was at this past summer, and I mentioned to you before, slaughter at Srebrenica was 8,000 Muslim men and boys. Estimates there are actually that about 15,000 Serbs participated directly in that slaughter and that violence because of the methods of killing. So the short answer to this question, how many people, is a lot. I mean, it takes a lot of people to commit genocide. But, again, we're never at a loss for finding those people. And for me, if there's a crisis in the human experience and human behavior, I'm hard-pressed to think of one that's more of a crisis than that we can so easily recruit people into the commission of this type of extraordinary evil. The second question then follows from that is, okay, these are thousands and thousands of people that do this. Who are they? And how are they enlisted to perpetrate this extraordinary evil? Now, people have asked this question before me, certainly, and they've given responses, and some of the responses have kind of focused on the extraordinary nature of the people who would perpetrate genocide and mass killing. And understand a bit the comfort level of this. If you can leave here and you can believe that the only people who could ever perpetrate genocide and mass killing are very unusual, extraordinary, atypical people, it makes it easier for us to sleep at night. We don't have to look at our neighbors and figure out, would they ever do anything like this, given a certain situation? We don't have to ask ourselves the very difficult question, would I ever do anything like this, given a certain situation? Because we can confine the problem to something over there and say, it's only those weird, extraordinary, different people who could do this. And in truth, this is how we often think of genocide. We want to say, well, it could only be the Holocaust. I mean, it's only kind of a Central European German phenomenon. But when you start again to list genocide in Rwanda, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Germany, in America, in the 1880s with westward expansion and the genocide of the native population in this country, at some point, it's occurring every place in the world. It's not a distinctly cultural or distinctly some extraordinary phenomenon only confined to one place in the world or only confined to one point in history. If it's confined to the human experience. I mean, that's the only confine you can put on it. Sometimes you're hit with a truth that is true, but is incredibly unpleasant and makes you think very less of yourself, makes you think much less of the people you sit next to, and much less of this world in which we live and work and love. Let me give you an idea of just a case study of what I'm trying to answer here. One of the most infamous perpetrators at Auschwitz was a guard at Auschwitz who was tried for atrocities after the Holocaust and was put to death. As a guard at Auschwitz for about a 2.5-year period, this man committed some of the worst atrocities and brutalities you can imagine. And I don't want this to be sensationalistic, and I'm going to spare you the details of much of what this man did. But suffice it to say that at Auschwitz, of all places, this man was known for the creativity in which he engaged in brutalities against men, women, and especially children. You flash back, though, 6 years in this man's life, and again, it's an easy story if I tell you 6 years before, this guy's a jerk. He's obnoxious, he's hateful, he's evil, and he's just waiting for something like the Holocaust to occur so he can express these impulses. But the story's more complex than that, because 6 years before, this man's a school teacher in southern Bavaria, a small community, teaches the equivalent of second, third grade. So an elementary school teacher. He is the man of the year in his community, year after year. He is very active in the Catholic Church. He's a wonderful father. He's a wonderful son. He's a doting husband. I mean, in truth, he is the type of male figure in that community that every man wishes he could be, that every man envies in some way because of the goodness and kindness of what the man seems to be. 6 years later, this man is in Auschwitz committing some of the worst brutalities that we can think of in the course of the worst brutality in history at that point in the Holocaust. What can we do educationally? What can we do politically, socially, religiously, morally? How can we construct a society in which genocide is never going to be impossible, but in which the creation of a pool of perpetrators is less likely? And if we can have that discussion with 20 junior-level government officials, some of which will one day become world leaders in some cases, I would expect, down the road, then hopefully we're training a generation of leaders in the world to understand the warning signs of genocide and how genocide might be prevented. Then finally, as we mentioned at the beginning, this book was originally published in 2002 as Becoming Evil. It was released in a second edition, revised and updated in 2007. So if you have questions or if you're working on papers and you want more information about any of the points I talked about today, you can find any of that easily in the second edition of Becoming Evil. You know, this is not, to me, a hopeless situation. I wouldn't work in it if it were hopeless. I think it's hopeful if we can have the understanding of how perpetrators are made, and we can live. We can get our hearts and minds around the idea that these are quote-unquote ordinary people. If we have that understanding, if we can grasp that idea, I think that puts us on the road to figuring out how we can stop perpetrators from being made. And hopefully years from now, a crisis popcorn forum here will not have to deal with this particular crisis, but could focus its attention on other crises at that point.
We need to examine how does the individual get to that level to cause such an atrocity? And I think it starts on a very basic premise. So I'd like to extend for a few more minutes on what we heard today to talk about the pyramid of hate. We tend to put things in a visual image. Like if we have the food pyramid, everything stacks up high. I think visual things we tend to fall a lot easier. So I'll talk with the pyramid of hate. There's 5 steps to the pyramid of hate. And the very first step, the basis of the pyramid, is the acts of bias. This includes stereotyping, jokes, or rumors, intensive remarks. It's something that we hear every day in the classroom, in the hallways, in the community. The next step on top of that are acts of prejudice. And that's the people of target groups are avoided or excluded from activities or social actions. Once again, I think this is a very basic principle that it occurs that we see happening in our daily life. While those two things might seem very small and insignificant, they form the basis of the pyramid to reach a higher level of hate. I think when an individual in a social group or a society, they find the first 2 levels okay to approach on, then we move to the next level, and that's the acts of discrimination, where there's harassment, the exclusion from social privileges, and educational opportunities. And so each thing, if an individual or a society okays one level, we move to the next level. On top of acts of discrimination, we move into acts of violence. And that's where we start with small offenses, and now we're moving into offenses that can be prosecuted. And so within those acts of violence, that's where we see terrorism, rape, assault, vandalism, and even riots. And remember that each one of these things, they don't occur on their own. It takes a period of time to realize that one level is socially acceptable where you can move up to the next. And then finally, we have the life-threatening acts, and that's genocide. And that's what we've heard of most of today.
Many of you might know the work of Carol Gilligan. She was a scholar many years ago when it wasn't fashionable to challenge the idea of moral development. And at that point, when she gave voice to the current power that defined moral authority and development from a male perspective, she wanted to study whether there was any difference between male and female in terms of moral development. In any event, what she did very quickly is that she took 9, 10, and 11-year-old children, male and female, and she told them a series of stories that had moral dilemmas to them. And then she asked them to solve it. What would you do? And I'm just going to very quickly tell you one story, interest of time, to exemplify an idea and then hit some of the points that Jim had discussed. She told the story of a porcupine and a gopher. Gophers and porcupine. And it was a day much like this, she describes, where it's cold and wet and dreary. And in this instance, she's talking about late fall. And she says in the earth, there is a lodge, there is a hole where these animal people are going to get ready for the coming winter. And there's porcupine and gopher, and they're cohabitating the same space. And porcupine, of course, has got quills and is in the lodge with all the gophers. And so every time porcupine moves, of course, what happens? Somebody gets pricked by the quills, right? So then Carol Gilligan asked the boys, what would you do? Well, some of them would say, cut the quills, kick the porcupine out. Ask the girls, what would you do? Well, we could build another house, another lodge, and then porcupine could go there. Then the other girls would say, no, if we did that, then they would be lonely. Well, we could take turns visiting the porcupine. So just very quickly, this idea of accommodation, or the idea of the ethic of caring. But not to say that, men, although in Jim's remarks he talked about there's a preponderance of males that do this, and more so lately women, but just to say that there is this moral dilemma around what Daniel Goleman called emotional intelligence. And certainly the hallmarks of emotional intelligence are caring, empathy, managing moods, these sorts of things. Where do we go with this? He says there's no evidence for abnormal personality. He talked about the one case study. Person was a model citizen, somebody that everybody wanted to aspire to be in the community, a good father, a good community person. So where does this all lead us to? It leads us to also what he talked about in terms of when you ask people on the ground why they did what they did, they say, well, my neighbor had a cow, or my neighbor had a radio, or my neighbor coveted your neighbor's goods. So what is the presupposition here? Scarcity of resources? Could be. Because I have often talked about that we have the other 3 R's. That we talk about literacy, writing, reading, and arithmetic, but what are the 3 R's of the root causes of human conflict, violence, or genocide in Jim's case? Race, religion, and resources. You look at the history of this planet. What are the root causes of all human conflict? Race, religion, and resources. Note in Kate when Jim talked about Africa and the water issues. So, what is the solution? Part of it could be the idea of what I saw in a cartoon many years ago in California. I think it was the San Francisco Chronicle. It was the Farley cartoon. And they were talking about drug and alcohol abuse as well as domestic violence. And what were to understand the causes and conditions are important. To understand how could you activate a different entelechy in a phenomenon, a social phenomenon. So, in this article, this little cartoon, it said, it's not about methadone programs. It's not about throw them in prison and stiffer incarceration. It's about improve reality. Interesting notion, improve reality. Or create a paradigm shift that says we live in the land of plenty. That the default setting is not scarcity, but abundance. Imagine that right now, that there's 6.4 billion human beings on this planet speaking over 6,000 languages and transcend the in-group and out-group by simply re-evaluating our relationship to our first mother, the Earth Mother, i.e., read in parentheses, resources. But here's my point. If we go from scarcity to abundance, and we also use the power of reason and logic, the altar that we worship on in a postmodern, highly civilized state of consciousness called Personhood 101, then we ought to be able to apply our technology in the presupposition of abundance. to think differently about the redistribution of wealth. And what does it mean to be healthy and happy and wealthy in the 21st century? And is it the trance and the romance and the grand seduction that we want the third world and the fourth world, i.e. the developing countries, to wear Levi's, drink Coca-Cola, and get the latest DVD? Or have a cell phone go off because everybody else is going off? Covet your neighbor. They have the cow. They have the radio. So what's the solution? When you think about, God bless you, when you think about, there's a solution, God. Beyond theological bent that creates the us against them, eh? Improved reality has to do with not only empathy development, compassion and caring, but also it has to do with the fundamental idea around human resilience. How do we persist and prevail? How do we create hope? Why is it that some people swim in the same waters in which others drowned? And if it is indeed, Jim, that you are right, that it is about behavior, and then ideology follows as some raison d'etre to justify and rationalize the behavior, so you don't compartmentalize how I feel, what I think, and how I behave, then I believe that one of the solutions is not more emotional intelligence and spiritual literacy, but also the practical architecture around resilience that suggests this: a sense of belongingness and connections that all human beings have, transcendent of culture and language, sense of belongingness, sense of connection, a sense of self-efficacy, the idea that we are not victims, that we have self-determination, that we are sovereign and having a voice in determining what happens to us. Thirdly, that there is a sense of uniqueness, even in those cultures that have more group emphasis and less individualism, that we still have this need to be unique. Do we not?
Dr. Waller, we're doing this documentary on, from a historical perspective, the horrors of genocide, and there's different types of victims in genocide. And I'd like to continue our conversation. In the documentary, we're also taking segments from your formal address at North College. We hear a lot about trying to identify genocide and indicate where it's happening now as well as in history. What do you identify as genocide?
Well, I think it's, as an academic scholar, you're aware of the academic tensions around the definition. In truth, most people work within the framework of the UN definition of genocide, the Genocide Convention of 1948. Genocide, a term not even invented until 1945-46 by Raphael Lemkin, but as the UN defines it, it's a systematic destruction in whole or in part of a racial, religious, national, or what they called ethnical group. Because that's the foundation for international law and convention, most of us default to using that when we define genocide, but we also recognize its limitations. It doesn't include political groups, it doesn't include gender groups, doesn't include socioeconomic class and standing, and most importantly, you have no idea of knowing what does in whole or in part mean. Is it, is there any number that goes with that? There's, the community has resisted putting a number on what constitutes genocide, but as we were talking about a bit earlier, I think the problem with it is because the term itself carries so much weight and so much currency to it that the human rights community looks at something that may not be defined as a genocide by the UN or the convention, and I think in some ways the world looks at it and thinks, well, if it's not a genocide, it's not serious. But there are certainly still very serious human rights violations that don't fit that technical definition per se.
I think I hear you saying, too, it's like in the whole human rights movement, if you look in this country in the last 50 years, when we talk about discrimination and protected classes, we've expanded those definitions and included groups that were not earlier in that. We obviously, and rightly so, emphasized race and national origin and ethnic background, but we've certainly, good examples have been disability and age and all. I hear you saying, I think also in defining genocide, we're looking at groups that were at one time not considered in that category.
Yeah, I think so very much. And so for me, when I think of genocide in current times, I contextualize it in the actions of a state against its civilian population. And any time a state is using physical terror and destruction in relation to its own population or a population it's recently conquered, I think that fits a definition of genocide in my understanding of it as state-sponsored terrorism.
As you indicated, it was in the 1940s that we heard the term for the first time of genocide, but certainly from your very effective presentation and also your incredible book that I would recommend, Becoming Evil, How Ordinary People Commit Genocide and Mass Killing, it's really, from recorded history, goes back before the awful, horrific Holocaust in the 1940s in Germany. Just share with us a little bit of some examples, not only of that one that we're so familiar with, and so many millions died under Nazism, but it happened before then, and it is still happening.
I think, you know, the most basic intro textbooks in genocide studies will pull Old Testament passages that show God even ordaining the genocide of whole groups of people. And really throughout history, we've seen case after case after case of a state turning on its own citizenry for whatever reason, ethnical, national, racial, religious, even political, and engaging in some form of extermination of those groups of people. Again, genocide occurs when it's not simply expulsion, it's not simply persecution, but it's actually some form of systematic physical destruction. And as I mentioned in the address, the 20th century claimed over 60 million victims of this type of state-sponsored terrorism or genocide, beginning in 1904 with German colonizers in Southwest Africa, and then at the end of the century, ending with the ethnic cleansing and genocidal activities in Bosnia-Herzegovina.
And then we had, of course, the 6 million Jewish people, but there were others that were part of the genocide in Nazi Germany too, such as the homosexual community and others.
Yeah, and this is one of the, I think, things we're coming to understand about genocide is certain groups are targeted. And I think the recognition of the Holocaust as a Jewish experience is a recognition of the fact and reality that there was one group the Nazis targeted for complete extermination. And that was the Jews. But anytime you have a systematic process of destruction like that aimed at one group, there will be other groups who start to get caught up almost as byproducts of that process of destruction and become involved in it as well. And in Nazi Germany, those were certainly political opponents, criminals, what were called asocials, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals would have been part of that, some Slavic peoples. So once a group, in this case Jews, are identified for extermination because they threaten the integrity of the German people, the genetic integrity, it becomes easy for a perpetrator to start to expand that and basically say, you know, as we think about it, homosexuals would threaten that integrity, Slavs would threaten that integrity, Gypsies would threaten that integrity, Sinti Roma people. And so I think that's where you start to see in every case of genocide a broadening of this definition of victimization.
You've indicated that it's not the technology that does the killing, it's human beings that are willing to engage in genocide. Based upon that, would you share with us, particularly when it's a movement from leaders to, or as they see the conditions are right that they could do this, how do those leaders that are involved convince a significant number of people that it's okay to eliminate, for example, an entire ethnic group or racial group?
Right.
What do they have to convince them to do to cause them to do that? In other words, the people they're going to eliminate, they don't consider them human, is that correct?
Right. Yeah, I think what leaders do, sometimes very intentionally, sometimes almost unintentionally, is they are able to draw a circle around themselves and the people like them. And anyone in that circle, they convince, we have the highest moral obligation to the people within our circle. But people who fall outside the circle, we have no moral obligation to them, and as a matter of fact, part of our moral obligation to ourselves is to exterminate anyone who doesn't fall in that circle. And I think they do that very often by painting them as a threat. In Nazi Germany, the Jews were a threat to the genetic integrity of the German folk. In Rwanda, Tutsis were a threat to Hutus and the Hutu way of life, and Tutsis were not to be trusted. They were traitors, they were economic conspirators, and a lot of the lies and mythology that we see throughout cases of genocide. So I think what leaders do effectively is they define who we are, and more importantly, who is not part of us. And then you start to have the political, legal, social, religious, theological justifications for why those people aren't part of us. And I think it is an escalating process at which it becomes not only are they not part of us, but they're simply not worthy of living any longer because of the threat they pose to us in some ways.
During my graduate school days, I had a professor, I thought he was quite brilliant in international affairs, and part of his study, and I'm wondering if your study indicated the same, in particular in the case of Germany, he indicated in his historical studies prior to Hitler that there was a deep-seated series of literature that had really convinced a lot of German people or the Aryans that they were superior. In all of these different examples, is there oftentimes the ground is laid through teachings and literature prior to the genocide itself?
Yeah, I think very much. I think in most of these cases of genocide, the target group is already on the periphery already for a variety of reasons, historical, theological, political, social, economic. And what a genocidal regime then is trying to do is to push them even further to the periphery and outside this circle of moral commitment and obligation. And in very few cases is that something they have to create anew. They're able, like Nazi Germany was, to build on 2,000 years of anti-Semitic teaching. Hutu extremists in Rwanda are able to build on some tribal and missionary-inspired mythologies about differences between Hutu and Tutsi to really very quickly push the Tutsi outside that boundary. Once those constraints of civilization have been dropped and a power has said, it's okay to do this, it's okay to persecute these people, it's okay perhaps even to exterminate them, most often they do build on a legacy of teaching that's come before that.
So education, I would assume, is extremely important for the future in trying to deal with this. In this documentary, as the others, we've not only been trying to identify some of the great crises, but also solutions. So what would you have to say about how can we prepare a society to possibly prevent this in the future through, I assume, among other things, the educational system?
Yeah. I think for me, prevention has two pieces to it. One is what societies can do within and for themselves in terms of education, governmental policy issues, and so on, that discourage this move to pushing people outside the bounds of moral commitment. And I certainly think within education and so on, given societies can do that. But the other piece of prevention is that the international community has to be aware of what are the warning signs of genocide. Because I think regimes are always going to have a chance to come to power and commit genocide if they want to. And as I've argued, regimes that want to commit genocide do, because they are totalitarian in the sense that they're able to take over total control of society and undo the teaching and the legislation and so on that may have protected groups of people. So for me, part of the prevention piece is an international eye that's able to look and say, okay, here's some of the warning signs of a country that seems bent on genocide, and at what stages can we intervene before it's too late? Because intervening after genocide has begun. I mean, as I mentioned, Rwanda, 800,000 victims in 100 days. If it takes you a couple weeks before you can get there and you decide to do anything, I mean, you measure that in the loss of thousands and thousands and thousands of lives because you theoretically didn't see it coming. So I think the international community needs a much better direction in terms of what are the warning signs of genocide, and then what do we do when some of those signs are being realized.
In thinking of hatred and from a historical perspective and tradition over a long period of time, I think that's kind of the forefront in recent years as we've looked at the Middle East and particularly what's been happening in Iraq. Throughout the Middle East, of course, in the Islamic world, there are two major forces that deal with the interpretation of the religion. One's the Sunni population and with the Shia population, and there's tremendous conflict, and it's a historical. Would you address that in the case, too, of if one particular force of the two is in power, as was happening in Iraq prior to the war with the Sunnis, 20% and controlling it? Do those conditions also create the possibility of genocide of one of the groups if they're not in power?
Yeah, I think especially if the group in power is a minority group, because I think one of the basics we know of political science is when the group in power is a minority group, there are a limited number of ways they can keep that power, and one of the strong ways is oppression and repression. And in many ways, it's what we're seeing in Rwanda today, which is a case I would know better than Iraq, and that the Tutsi government, the Tutsis were victims of the '94 genocide, are now in power in Rwanda, but they only constitute about 15% of the Rwandan population. And there's some recognition that to keep power, there will be some extent of oppression and repression of Hutu in that society to ensure that Tutsis stay in power. And I think that's the world's concern in Rwanda now, is how does a minority retain power in a fair, democratic, just way? How does it, instead of moving from that, as Raymond said earlier, the power over a people, to sharing power with people, that would make this a stable society?
We saw the same thing in South Africa for a very long time in apartheid and denial of vote, where 20% of the population was controlling the other 80%.
Right.
But is South Africa an example where once that freedom came and independence, the 20% that had power and lost their control, but haven't they done some significant work of balancing it so that the majority then is not doing to the 20% what was done to them?
Yeah, no, they have, and I think if we could go back a few years in time to when apartheid ended, I mean, this was the world's big question, is what are these people going to do who have been repressed and persecuted for so long now that they have the power? And for a variety of historical reasons, and I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission certainly been part of that, South Africa has been able to pull that transition off in ways that it's too early to tell for Rwanda. If Rwanda can do the same, of a persecuted people now in power, can they hold and can they share that power in ways that don't lead to retribution and retaliation against those who persecuted them for a long period of time? And again, South Africa, I think, has been able to pull that off, and the question is, will some of those models that help South Africa translate well to Rwanda and the cultural differences there?
In addition to the cultural processes, international organizations such as the United Nations, others, if they can become involved, or like NATO did in Eastern Europe when the ethnic cleansing was taking place, can, without just mandating it from outside, but can those institutions encourage a structure of government like we did in this country a long time ago, where you have dividing of power, separation of powers, and checks and balances? I would contend that one reason why we've been as successful as we divide power between the national government and the states, and then we divide again between the branches of government. Is that part of the solution in those areas where there's such a long history of hatred?
No, I think that's a great point. I think the role of international intervention in constructing post-genocidal societies and reconstructing them is pivotal. And I do see the need for international direction and intervention in things like divided powers of the government, especially in these situations where you have minorities in power. I think the issue that, you know, for me is more intriguing is where the international community has to learn to step back and say, we can't do this piece of it in the reconstruction. And I think part of that is in forgiveness and reconciliation. I think to the degree that a place like Rwanda can own its own process, as South Africa did, of how we reconcile, what role forgiveness plays in that, what role punishment plays in that, I want that to be Rwanda's call. To me, that ought not to be the international community's call. But with that said, certainly the international community can give aid in terms of government structure, economic aid, that allow a society torn apart by the worst of all things, a state terrorizing its own citizens, to regain a stability and allow it to grow.
On one of our documentaries, we spent the entire 1 hour dealing with terrorism. Now, when you have situations, was in Germany and World War II, and when the country was defeated, we had a lot to do, and the British and others, with restructuring the country and promoting democracy. There was a very literate population, and so you can have some social engineering in those situations. But now that we're dealing with, and a lot it's religious-based, with the terrorists and extremism that's outside of countries, and yet they have the desire to, I would suggest, engage in the genocide of those for religious reasons or for racial, whatever it may be. Isn't that another different type of challenge? How do you deal with that sales across the world when they want to continue to do that, when it's not a defeated country where you can go in and restructure?
Yeah, and it's not just that challenge of it's not a defeated country, but it's an ideology that crosses nation-state boundaries, but it's also the challenge that the U.S. faces of the world sees us very differently today than they saw us in 1945. I mean, we had a bank of goodwill there that we could draw on that we probably don't have quite as much of today, and the UN is still trying to find its role 50 years later in this reconstruction of societies. But I think the point you raise is a key one, which is many of these issues of terrorism today are no longer bounded by nation-state identities and boundaries. They are religious ideologies that transcend nation-states in many ways and will make the notion of it being defeated certainly it's a different way of understanding defeat and victory than it would have been in World War II.
And my final question is, are you optimistic about the future in dealing with this very serious problem?
I am optimistic. I would say I'm cautiously optimistic because, again, I think the exponential population growth, scarcity of resources, conflict's going to be with us for a long time until we learn how to manage those two issues, which are very much related. But I do see a movement of human rights activists around the world, international law figures around the world that recognize that instability anywhere, and this kind of paraphrase King's famous quote, that instability anywhere is a threat to stability everywhere. And I think we know that today better than we've ever known it because of globalization, because of technology, and it's linking to us other places in the world. So my optimism is we know the seriousness of the problem and we know how it impacts us. And in that knowledge, we have to be able to find solutions to it.
Dr. James Waller, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you very much.
With today's documentary, we are closing out a series of 5 one-hour documentaries titled Earth in Crisis, A Search for Solutions. On today's documentary, our subject was the horrors of ethnic and tribal genocide in the 21st century. I want to conclude this series of documentaries by thanking particularly KSPS TV Channel 7 in Spokane, a PBS affiliate, a very outstanding station. They've given us lots of their time and did the editing for these series of programs. I also wish to thank the Teachers Credit Union, the Spokane Teachers Credit Union, for their assistance in putting together the programs with printing our programs. And I certainly want to thank North Idaho College and also particularly the instructional media staff that's been so instrumental in this series. Thank you for viewing these documentaries. On our 5th and final documentary of this series, dealing with Earth in Crisis, A Search for Solutions, you have just been watching, the viewers, the issue of the horrors of ethnic and tribal genocide with an incredible expert, Professor James Edward Waller, Jr. I think he's the best that I've ever heard on dealing with his book, in particular, Becoming Evil, How Ordinary People Commit Genocide and Mass Killing. We're going to do what we've done on the other 4 documentaries. We're now going to invite our town hall meeting individuals to respond to this documentary as we end this series. Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, Dr. Waller in his book indicates that individuals often have many very decent, good parts about them, but there is also weaknesses and there's even evil in the world. And his thesis is, as you can see on the documentary, is that in mass gatherings and all, with very powerful leaders and leaders with bad motives, that people can be convinced to do very evil things. In fact, his thesis goes so far as to say you need to be very careful how much potential is it for each of us to do evil things. And he uses that to explain in the 20th century that awful Holocaust under Hitler. And then he talks a lot about genocide in the 21st century. And he uses Sudan as an example, but many others. And in his presentation, as our viewers saw, how in some parts of Africa and other places where people would use tools and instruments to kill people all day long and go home exhausted from just killing. So we want to really do some analysis with you about this final documentary. And we welcome back Erna Reinhardt, who's been on our panel at the North Idaho College Public Forum for over 5 years. She's Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College. In a moment, she'll ask the first question. But I have to also, once again, say thanks to Janelle Burke, who's here and who's participating
and has been on the panel for 33 years. You were a very loyal panelist. And with that, Erna, you asked the first question.
Thank you, Tony, and I just want to take a minute to thank you for inviting all of us to be part of your week-long series, or month-long series, actually, on all of these documentaries. It's an honor for all of us to be here, and this is kind of a bittersweet day for us as we say goodbye to Tony Stewart, who has been at North Idaho College and has been part of public television for a very, very, very long time. So we'll say our goodbyes later, but I just wanted to thank you for inviting all of us, and I think we have all had a great experience this month being here and going through all of these topics.
Thank you for being here.
Genocide. This is a very serious, heavy topic, and I know one of the things that I think Dr. Waller was trying to explain was that there's a psychology that is involved in this, correct? So how do we, as citizens, what can we do in any way possible in our lives and in our small world to make this not happen? How can we counter this? How can we be more aware that maybe someone may be a little psychologically off kilter? How can we counter this?
I'm Philippe Valla, graphic design instructor at North Idaho College. I think that it starts from the one person. If you see something that is out of the norm, I think it's important to communicate. It's not like saying somebody does something wrong and next door, by being observing of behavior of people and be, as an individual, notice something is not quite right here. Can we look into this? It doesn't mean that we're going to investigate everybody, but I noticed this group, this activity here next door in another country that will go up to a government level. Can we look into this? There's maybe something that we can stop or look into it, not necessarily stop, but observe. There's something wrong here. This is not in the norm. I think if we act that way, maybe it's a start, observing what the problem is, and maybe we can find a solution. So not staying passive. Oh, not going to happen to us, it's over there. And taking the example of Sudan. So it's over there, it's not us. It doesn't involve us. So as individual and citizen, maybe we want to voice our opinion and be more aware of the surrounding. Engage a conversation, try to stop or at least discuss. Maybe somebody will make some decision or more people get involved, and maybe we can stop a situation that can be worse down the road. Hitler, I'm sure we could have stopped him maybe.
Okay, thank you.
Bob Bennett, Executive Director of the Human Rights Education Institute, former president of NIC. When I watched the vote that was taken when we decided that we were going to go to war, I watched the people who were responsible for those votes, and I think they were so afraid not to appear patriotic that they did not act as they